In England in the age of Regency, a marriage contract and a bill of sale are the same document. The only difference is what you are selling and whether you know it. Cecily Thorne knew it. She had read enough of her father's papers in the 3 years since he died and left her a household that understood nothing about its own finances to know precisely what she was signing on the morning of the 14th of October, 1816. She was signing over her name and her person and the theoretical remainder of her prospects in exchange for the discharge of a debt she had not made and could not have paid. She signed without hesitation, because hesitation would have been dishonest. She had no intention of refusing, and pretending otherwise would have been a performance for an audience she did not respect. She arrived at Ashmore Hall that afternoon with 2 trunks and a volume of French philosophical essays she had been reading for 6 weeks and intended to finish regardless of what else happened. She sat in the chair beside the window with the book open on her lap and decided she would not be frightened. She was not frightened. She was something more difficult. She was curious. And curiosity, in her experience, was always more dangerous. When he came in, he looked at her, and then he looked at the book, and then he sat down in the chair on the other side of the window and said, "May I continue?" She handed him the book. He did not look at her when he took it. She did not look at him when she let it go. Neither of them slept well that night, but not for the reason either had feared. The debt had a history, as debts of a certain size always do. It had begun, as best Cecily had been able to reconstruct it from her father's papers, with the commercial contract in the autumn of 1806, a partnership arrangement with a trading concern that had promised significant returns on the Derbyshire wool market, and had instead, over the course of 3 years, systematically transferred the Thorne family's capital into accounts that Cecily had traced to 3 different names and one consistent outcome. Her father had not understood what was happening until it was largely complete. By the time he understood it, he was ill, and by the time he was able to have it properly examined by a solicitor, he was dead, and by the time Cecily had found the right papers in the right order to understand the full shape of it, 2 more years had passed, and the debt had accumulated interest with the patient indifference of a process that does not require anyone's attention to continue. Her brother William understood the number. He did not understand the architecture. He had spent 2 years being desisted about it in ways that were genuine and entirely unhelpful, and Cecily had spent 2 years managing both the distress and the architecture. And by the time the letter arrived from the offices of a solicitor named Cecil in Derby, she had a clearer picture of the Thorne family's situation than anyone else alive, which was not a comfortable thing to be, but was at least a useful one. The letter proposed a resolution. The resolution was matrimonial. The party proposing it was Nathaniel Crale, the Duke of Ashmore, who was 31 years old and possessed of a large estate in Derbyshire that Cecily had heard of in the way that one hears of large estates as a feature of the local landscape, present and noted and not particularly relevant to daily life. He required a wife with sufficient education to manage certain correspondence and records that his current staff could not handle. In exchange, the Thorne debt would be discharged in full and the family's remaining land secured. Cecily read the letter twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, more slowly, because she had learned from her father's experience that the significant content of a financial document was rarely in the prominent sentences. The prominent sentences said what they wanted you to understand. The subordinate clauses said what was actually true. The subordinate clauses of Kessel's letter were, she concluded, accurate and not deceptive, which was more than she had expected, and she wrote back agreeing to meet with Cecil before any decision was made. The meeting with Cecil confirmed what the letter had said and added some things the letter had not. Nathaniel Crale had inherited the dukedom 6 years ago under circumstances that had left the estate's administrative records in some disarray. He needed someone who could manage French commercial correspondence, of which there was apparently a significant volume connected to certain historical contracts. He did not, Kessel indicated with the careful neutrality of a solicitor for conveying his client's preferences without editorializing, require much else in the way of a wife. Cecily said she would think about it. She thought about it for 4 days, which was the amount of time it took her to be certain that there was no alternative she had not considered, and then she wrote to Kessel and said yes. She did not meet Nathaniel Crale before the wedding, which was held on a Tuesday morning at the parish church in the village near the Thorne house, a short ceremony, practical and unadorned, with William and Peg and Kessels and the vicar and nobody else. Nathaniel arrived on time, which she had not been entirely certain of. He was tall and had the contained quality of a man who had learned at some point to take up less space than his actual dimensions, and he looked at her when she arrived at the church door with the focused, assessing attention of someone reading a document they need to understand quickly. She looked back at him with the same expression, because it was the only one she had available that was honest. They signed the register. He handed her into the carriage with the correctness of a man who has been told what is expected of him and has decided to do it properly. The carriage ride to Ashmore Hall was 40 minutes, during which she looked out the window, and he looked at a document he had taken from his coat pocket, and neither of them spoke, which she found obscurely a relief. Performed conversation would have been worse. Ashmore Hall appeared in the late afternoon light, and it was large, and it was in better condition than she had expected, given the description of its administrative situation, which told her something about where his attention had gone and where it had not. The housekeeper, a composed woman called Bess, showed her to her rooms, which were clean and well prepared and smelled of fresh linen, and left her to change and collect herself before dinner. She changed. She did not particularly need to collect herself, because she had been collected for the past week in the manner of someone who has made a decision and is executing it, and does not see the point of unraveling now. She sat in the chair beside the window, which faced west and had the last of the October light coming through it, and she opened the French philosophical essays to the page she had last been reading, which was page 94, and she read. She was on page 97 when the knock came. She said, "Come in." He opened the door and looked at her in the chair, at the book in her lap, at the window, and the light and the room with the same assessing attention from the church door. And she looked back at him and thought, he was not expecting this, and the thing he was not expecting is not my presence, but my composure, and this is interesting. He came in. He did not go to the bed, which she had been aware of across the room, with the awareness one has of things one is pointedly not thinking about. He came across the room and sat down in the chair. On the other side of the window, there were 2 chairs, angled toward each other and toward the glass, which was a room arrangement that suggested the previous occupant had used this window for sitting rather than for looking, and he looked at the book in her lap with the specific attention of someone who has recognized something. "May I continue?" he said, and he indicated the book with a slight angle of his head. She looked at him. He was looking at the book, not at her, and the question was entirely serious. And she understood with the particular speed of someone who reads things carefully that he had read this book, or was reading it, and that the question was about the text and not about anything else, and that this was simultaneously the most unexpected thing he could have said and the most clarifying. She held the book out. He took it, opened it to a page near the front, page 31, she noted, which meant he was behind her but not far behind, and began to read. She had nothing to read. She sat in the chair and looked at the window and the darkening October sky and thought about page 31 and what it said, which was an argument about the relationship between obligation and genuine action, and whether a thing done under compulsion could ever be the same as the same thing done freely. She had opinions about this. After a few minutes, she said, without planning to, "He is wrong about the third premise." Nathaniel looked up. He looked at her with the attention she was beginning to understand simply how he listened. "Which premise?" "That the external constraint changes the nature of the act. It changes the circumstances. It does not change what the act is." She paused. "If I give you my coat because I am cold and cannot carry it, and you give me your coat because I am cold and you are not, we have both given a coat. What we have done is the same. Why we have done it is different." The essay conflates the two. He looked at the book. Then he looked at her with an expression she could not read yet, because she had not had enough time with his face to have catalogued its expressions, and he said, "That is precisely what I thought on page 33. He addresses it, but not adequately." "Show me," she said. He turned to page 33 and held the book out to her. She took it and read the passage and said, "He has noticed the problem and then talked around it." "Yes," he said, with a satisfaction that was not triumphant but confirmed the satisfaction of someone whose assessment has been corroborated by a source they respect. He said it as though he had been waiting for someone to say yes to that specific observation, and she thought, how long has he been having this conversation with himself? They talked about the essay until the light was entirely gone from the window and Bess knocked to say dinner was ready. And over dinner they talked about the second section, which concerned property and inheritance, and she had considerably more to say about that than the philosophical framing probably warranted. And he listened without interrupting and asked one question that was better than the question she would have asked, and she told him so. He left after dinner. She went back to the chair by the window, which was dark now, and sat with the book and thought about what it meant to be in a situation she had prepared herself for, and find that the preparation was entirely wrong, not because the situation was worse than she had imagined, but because it was different in a direction she had not considered, and she was not accustomed to having failed to consider a direction. She was, she thought, in considerably more difficulty than a woman who had simply married a cold man for practical reasons and could manage her expectations accordingly. She was in the difficulty of a woman who had married an intelligent man who had sat down in her chair and asked about her book, and who had opinions about page 33, and with whom she was going to have to live in the same house for the rest of her life. She held the book and did not read it, and outside the October dark lay over Derbyshire with the absolute certainty of something that has decided to be what it is. The first week at Ashmore Hall established itself with the logic of a place that has its own rhythms and is not going to alter them for a new arrival, which Cecily found she did not mind. She was shown the household by Bess, who was thorough, did not treat her as an ornament, and she learned the kitchen schedule and the staff hierarchy and the particular way the east corridor door stuck in damp weather and needed to be lifted slightly before it would open. She learned that the estate office was on the ground floor and that Nathaniel was in it before 7 most mornings, and that the accounts she had been told she would be working with were kept there in a set of shelves that had been recently reorganized, which suggested someone had known she was coming and had prepared accordingly. On the third morning, she went to the estate office before breakfast and looked at the shelves. The French correspondence was in 4 boxes, chronologically ordered, spanning 12 years. She lifted the lid of the first box and looked at the top document, which was in the legal French of a commercial contract, formal, precise, the kind of French that was not taught in drawing rooms, but in counting houses and legal chambers. She read the first paragraph and understood it completely and felt, for the first time since the carriage ride from the Thorne house, that she knew where she was. Nathaniel came in at 7 and found her at the desk with the first box open and a sheet of paper beside her, on which she had already made 3 notes. He looked at the notes without commenting on them and went to his own desk and began his own work. And they worked in the same room for 2 hours without speaking, which should have been uncomfortable and was not, and Schley filed this alongside the chair by the window and page 33 as a data point she did not yet know what to do with. On the fifth day, Peg, who had been watching the household with the sharp, practical eyes of a woman who had grown up in a village and trusted what she observed over what she was told, said to Cecily, while brushing her hair, that the Duke seemed to read a great deal. "Yes," Cecily said. "And you seem to read a great deal," Peg said. "Yes," Cecily said. Peg said nothing further, which was Peg's version of an opinion. On the seventh day, Cecily went to the bookshelf in the main library to find a reference she needed, and found the French philosophical essays on the third shelf, which was not where she had left it, because she had left it on the desk in her room. It had been returned to the library, presumably by Nathaniel, and it had a draftsman's pencil inserted as a bookmark at page 89. She was on page 102. He had nearly caught up. She took it back to her room and left a different book in its place. The shelf, a volume of French legal commentary from her father's collection that she had brought in one of the trunks because she thought she might need it. She put her own bookmark in it at a passage about commercial obligations. She did not know why she did this. She did it anyway. November came to Derbyshire, the way it always did, gradually and then completely, the color going out of the landscape in stages until what remained was the structural truth of things. The bone of the hills, the black lines of the hedgerows, the particular gray of limestone in flat light. Cecily found she preferred it to October. October had the distraction of beauty. November showed you what was actually there. What was actually there at Ashmore Hall was more than she had been told and less than she had feared. The estate was large and imperfectly administered and had, in the years since Nathaniel's father died, accumulated the specific kind of disorder that comes not from neglect, but from a period of concentrated attention to one problem at the expense of everything else, as though someone had spent 6 years holding a particular wall up with both hands, and had not had the hands free to address the other walls. The French commercial correspondence was the center of it. She understood this within the first 2 weeks, before she had read more than a third of the boxes, because the French correspondence was where the money questions lived, and the money questions were where Ashmore's real complexity was hiding. She worked through it methodically. An hour in the morning before Nathaniel arrived, 2 hours in the afternoon when the light from the south window was best, occasional evenings when a particular document required sustained attention. She made notes in a leather-covered book she had bought in Darby on the one occasion she had been taken to town, and she organized her questions in the order she would need to answer them. And she did not raise anything with Nathaniel until she was certain enough of her ground to be useful, rather than merely preliminary. He noticed. He did not say so, but she had begun to understand the language of his attention, the slight shift in how he held himself when something was worth thinking about, the quality of that managing something rather than simply receiving it. When she mentioned at dinner on the 12th of November that the third box of correspondence contained a contract that she was not able to reconcile with the income figures for the north pasture, he put down his fork and said, "Which contract?" with the focus of a man who has been waiting for that specific sentence. "The arrangement with the Beaumont Trading Concern," she said, dated 1812. The English summary in the estate files describes a fixed annual payment. The French original describes a percentage arrangement. They are not the same contract. He was quiet for a moment. How large is the discrepancy? Over 6 years, if the percentage has been applied to the actual yield figures, approximately £400 in our favor. If the English summary has been used, which is what the accounts reflect, we have been undercharging. She paused. Or someone else has been collecting the difference. He looked at her across the dinner table with the expression that was not the page 33 expression and not the assessing in expression from the church door, but something between them more alert, less contained. You are certain of the translation. I am certain of the French, she said. The English summary was prepared by someone who either did not read the original carefully or did not want to. Or both, he said. Or both, she agreed. He picked up his fork again, which meant the question had been received and filed, and he was going to think about it before he did anything else with it, which was how he handled most things of significance. She had come to find this quality, the refusal to act before understanding, more valuable than she had expected. It was rarer than it looked. It was in the second week of November, on a Tuesday, when the rain had kept her inside all morning, and she had worked through the fourth box of correspondence with the focused efficiency of someone grateful for weather that eliminates other options, that she found the letter. She was not looking for it. She was looking for a document that Kessel had referenced in a cover letter from 1814, and the drawer contained, in addition to what she was looking for, a bundle of papers tied with a different ribbon from the estate correspondence, a faded red ribbon, the kind used for personal documents rather than business ones, which meant someone had placed it here deliberately and not as part of the filing system. She put it aside. She found the Kessel document. She closed the drawer. She opened the drawer again. The bundle was tied with the ribbon and sealed with a wax seal that had been broken and repressed, which meant it had been opened at some point and then closed again. She untied it. Inside were 3 letters, all in the same hand, a cramped, urgent hand that was nothing like Nathaniel's compressed precision, and the top letter was addressed to no one and dated 3 months before the death of the previous Duke of Ashmore, 8 years ago. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again, more slowly. The letter said, "The Thorne debt is not what they believe it to be. I have tried to find a way to address this without, but there is no way that does not." It stopped there. Unfinished. The sentence had been started 3 times and abandoned 3 times, and the 4th attempt had apparently not been made. It was a letter that had been written by someone who knew they needed to say something, could not find the form in which to say it, and who had run out of time before they found it. She sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The rain moved against the windows. From somewhere below, she could hear the household going about its work, the kitchen sounds, the particular creak of the back staircase, Peg's voice saying something brief and practical to someone in the corridor. She looked at the letter and thought about the Thorne debt and the specific phrase, "not what they believe it to be," and she thought about what she believed it to be, which was the result of a failed commercial venture that had systematically extracted capital from her father's estate through a series of contracts her father had not understood. She thought about who else might have understood them. She put the letter back in its bundle and retied the ribbon and replaced it precisely as she had found it, with the care of someone who does not yet know what they have found and does not want to disturb it before they do. She said nothing to Nathaniel. Frederick Stein arrived on a Thursday afternoon at the end of November, riding a horse that had been ridden hard over distance, and with the expression of a man who had arranged his own arrival to appear casual and had not entirely succeeded. He was 40-something, well-dressed in the way of men who understand that appearance is a form of argument, and he greeted Nathaniel in the entrance hall with the warmth of a man who has established over time a particular kind of claim on another person's company. He greeted Cecily with the attentive interest of someone assessing a new variable in a situation they had thought they understood. "Your wife," he said to Nathaniel, with the slight emphasis of a man who is noting something he finds unexpected. "Yes," Nathaniel said. Frederick turned to her with a smile that had been constructed to be charming and said that he had heard a great deal about the Thorne family's long presence in Derbyshire, and that it was a pleasure to welcome her to the county's social world. He said this with the fluency of a man who says this kind of thing often and has refined it to the point where it takes no effort. And she said thank you and looked at his face and thought, he is measuring something, and the measurement is more important to him than the conversation. He stayed for dinner. Over dinner, he talked about London and the season, and several people Cecily did not know, and two that she did. And he was, she admitted, good company in the specific way of men who have made a study of being good company. He asked Nathaniel about the estate with the practiced direction of a man who wants information and knows how to extract it without appearing to seek it. Nathaniel answered without providing more than was asked, which was, Cecily thought, a form of awareness. She watched them together. She had learned, from years of managing a household and a brother who did not always understand what was happening around him, to read the dynamic between two people from the things that were not said as readily as from the things that were. What she read between Nathaniel and Frederick was not friendship, though it had the form of friendship. It was something more like a long-standing arrangement between two people who understood each other's positions and had reached, without ever discussing it, an accommodation. Frederick asked, near the end of the evening, about the correspondence boxes, casually, in the way of a man mentioning something he has just thought of. He said he recalled that the old Duke had had some business with French commercial interests, and he wondered whether any of that had been recently sorted out. My wife is working through the correspondence, Nathaniel said. Frederick looked at her. The assessment was brief and entirely concealed behind the charm, but she saw it. How very capable, he said, and the word capable was doing several things at once, none of which were what it appeared to be doing. It is interesting work, she said pleasantly, and told him about a particularly complex clause in the 1812 contract in enough technical detail that he would understand she had read it, and that his understanding of her as an ornamental presence was incorrect, without telling him anything he could use. He received this with good grace and changed the subject, which told her his French was not sufficient to know what she had just said, which told her something else. After Frederick left the next morning, she went to the estate office and stood for a moment looking at the fourth drawer before she began work. Then she opened it, took out the bundle with the red ribbon, and moved it to the locked drawer she had been given for her own use, on the reasoning that if Frederick returned and found himself with the opportunity to look through the estate office, it would be better if he did not find it. She did not tell Nathaniel she had moved it. She told herself this was because she had not yet decided what it meant. This was partly true. The evenings had developed a pattern without either of them deciding it should. 3 or 4 times a week, if neither of them had obligations elsewhere, they end up in the library not by arrangement, but by the gravity of a place that suited them both, and the fact that they both moved toward it at the same hour for reasons neither had articulated. She read. He read. Sometimes one of them said something and the other answered, and it became a conversation. Sometimes it did not become a conversation, and the silence was of the kind that has weight and texture rather than absence. She was reading on a Tuesday evening in late November when she heard him make a sound, not a word. Just a sound that meant something on the page had been confirmed or resolved. She looked up and saw him close a volume and set it aside, satisfaction of a man who has finished something he has been thinking about for a long time. The legal commentary, he said, without preamble. He said it the way he said things he had been considering directly, without the approach that most people used when they were about to admit something. The one you left on the shelf. The passage you marked about commercial obligations. She said nothing. It concerns what happens when one party to a contract had knowledge that the other did not, he said. When the terms were agreed under conditions that were not equal. He looked at the fire. It is a specific passage to have bookmarked. It is a passage that seemed relevant, she said carefully. He looked at her then, and the expression was the one she had not catalogued, not the page 33 expression, not the assessing one, not the one that appeared when she said something that confirmed his own assessment. This one she had seen only twice before, briefly, and had not been able to read. She still could not read it fully, but she could read its edges, and the edges said, "He knows what passage she has marked, and he knows why it is relevant, and he is deciding something. There are things about the estate's history," he said, "that are not in the correspondence boxes." "I know," she said. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. The fire was the only sound in the room, and outside the November dark was as absolute over the Derbyshire hills. "When you are ready to discuss them," he said, "I will be here." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Not yet." "All right," he said, and picked up a new book, and that was all. She sat with her own book unopened in her lap, and thought about the letter with the red ribbon and the unfinished sentence, and all the ways a thing could be known and still not said, and whether there was a version of this house in which she would eventually understand with everything that had built it, and whether she wanted to. She thought she did. She was not yet certain she was ready for what understanding it would cost. The dispute about the North Pasture revenue announced itself formally in December through a letter from a firm of French commercial solicitors in London, acting on behalf of the Beaumont trading concern, which stated that it had come to the attention that certain payments under the 1812 contract had been incorrectly calculated, and that it was seeking restitution of the difference based on the English summary of the agreement, which it held as the operative document. Cecily read the letter at breakfast. She read it twice. Then she set it beside her plate and ate the remainder of her toast, and thought about the difference between what the letter was claiming and what she had found when she read the original, and the specific phrase operative document, which was doing a great deal of work in a small space. "They are claiming based on the English summary," she said. Nathaniel was reading the letter's second page. "Yes. They know the summary says something different from the original, evidently, and they are counting on the estate not having read the original." He set the letter down and looked at her with the focused attention. "Can you establish what the original says clearly enough to contest the claim?" "I already have," she said. "I made a full translation in November. It is in the locked drawer." She paused. "I would like to write to Cecil and ask him to engage a French legal specialist to verify my translation before we respond. Not because I doubt the translation, but because I want an independent attestation when we contest." "Do that today," he said. She did. She also, on the same afternoon, went through the remaining correspondence boxes to ensure she had not missed anything connected to the Beaumont concern, and she found 2 additional letters that had not been in the original estate files. Letters that had been placed, she thought, in the wrong box either by accident or by someone who had hoped they would not be looked for. She read them carefully. She added them to the locked drawer. The French legal specialist arrived from Derby on a Thursday in the middle of December, a precise man of 50 named Beale, who examined her translation for 2 hours and said, with the slight surprise of someone who had expected to find errors and had not found them, that it was accurate in every material respect, and that the original French clearly established a percentage arrangement rather than a fixed payment. He confirmed this in writing, which she had asked him to do before he arrived. She placed his written confirmation beside her translation in the locked drawer and wrote to Cecil. It was in the week before Christmas, when the household had acquired the particular quality of a house preparing for something without being entirely certain what form the preparation should take, that she met old Dunnet. He was a tenant farmer, the oldest on the estate, who had been on Ashmore land since before Nathaniel's father had inherited the title. He came to the hall to deliver, as he apparently did every December, a jar of preserved plums that his wife made, and that Bess received with the warmth of a long-established ritual. Cecily was crossing the entrance hall when he arrived, and Bess introduced them, and he looked at her with the steady, assessing look of a man who has a great many things change over a long life and has learned to take the measure of a new one. Miss Thorne, he said before correcting himself. Your Grace, I should say. I knew your father. Did you? She said. He came out to the eastern boundary once, years ago. Had a question about the drainage. He paused. Pause had a quality she noticed, not hesitation, but consideration, the kind that happens when a person is deciding how much of what they are thinking to say. A good man, careful. Too trusting of some things, maybe. His eyes moved, briefly, to something above her head, some point in the middle distance, and then came back. But that was a long time ago now. Something in the way he said a long time ago was not elegiac, it was protective. She had heard this quality in voices before, in her brother's voice. When he talked about the year their father died and the season of conversations he had not known how to have. It was the quality of someone placing a careful distance between themselves and a thing they had witnessed. She said, I have been going through some of the older correspondence, from around that time. He looked at her. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he said, with the practiced vagueness of a man who has decided in his next sentence very quickly, well, the old Duke kept a great deal of paper. I never understood half of it. He touched the brim of his hat. Good day to you, Your Grace. He walked back to the yard, and she watched him go, and thought about what a long time ago meant when someone used it to protect themselves rather than to mark time, and what he had not said about her father and the eastern boundary, and the careful way his eyes had moved away from hers. She went back to the estate office and opened the 4th box again, and read for another hour, and found nothing new, and closed it, and sat at the desk, looking at the locked drawer, and thought about the letter with the red ribbon and the unfinished sentence, and thought about Nathaniel in the library saying, there are things about the estate's history that are not in the correspondence boxes, and thought about how much she still did not know, and how certain she was becoming that not knowing it was not accidental. The Christmas dinner at Ashmore was small. Nathaniel did not entertain at scale, which she was coming to understand was characteristic rather than circumstance. And Frederick came, and 2 neighboring families, and a woman named Dorothea Ancroft, who was a widow of 50, and who had the frank, clear-eyed manner of someone who has outlived several versions of the social world, and found she preferred honesty to its alternatives. Dorothea sat beside Cecily at dinner, and talked about the county and the families in it, with the fond, unsentimental accuracy of long acquaintance. And Cecily listened and found her useful in the way that an honest source always useful, not for what she said about people, which was generous but truthful, but for what she noticed about situations. Frederick at dinner was in good spirits. He talked well, as he always did, and drew out the neighboring families and made himself agreeable to everyone at the table. And Cecily watched him from the other end and thought, he is most charming when he is most comfortable, and he is most comfortable when he believes nothing threatens his position. The position she was beginning to understand he occupied at Ashmore was not the position of a friendly cousin. It was something more like the position of a man who had been allowed, over time, to install himself as a necessary presence, someone without whom certain things could not quite be managed. She did not yet understand what the certain things were. Near the end of dinner, Frederick said something she caught only the tail of it, about the old arrangements being sometimes the most efficient, and she saw Nathaniel's jaw set in the manner she had come to read as the external evidence of controlled attention. It was the expression he wore when he was managing something rather than simply responding to it. When the guests had gone and the house had settled into its late evening quiet, she came into the library and found him there, which she had expected, with a glass of wine and the particular stillness of someone who has been sitting in one position for long enough that moving would require a conscious decision. She sat down in the chair opposite. The fire had been recently built up and the room was warm, and the December dark was outside the windows, And it was, she thought, exactly the room for saying something difficult, and she thought about saying it, and then she did not, because she was still not certain of all of it, and she had learned from her father's experience that acting on incomplete understanding was its own form of damage. "He is here often," she said instead. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "And you would prefer he were not?" A pause. "That is not a question." "No," she said. He looked at the fire. "Frederick has been coming to Ashmore for 6 years," he said. "Since my father died. He finds it convenient." The word convenient was precise and was doing what he intended it to do. "I have not yet found a satisfactory resolution to the convenience." She looked at him. There was more in that sentence than the words, and she had learned enough of his language to hear it. "The Beaumont claim," she said. "Did he know about it before the letter arrived?" The pause was longer this time. "I believe he was aware that it might be coming," he said. She looked at the fire and thought about a man who finds Ashmore convenient and who knew a legal claim was coming before it was filed, and what he would have gained from the claim succeeding, and whether the two mismatched documents, the French original and the English summary, had been mismatched by accident or by assistance. "I have Beale's attestation," she said, "and my translation, and the Kessel correspondence. When the claim is formally contested, we have sufficient documentation." "I know," he said. He said it with the quality she had come to recognize as gratitude expressed in a register that did not use the word Cecily. She looked at him. "The things I said in November," he said, "about things not in the correspondence boxes. I meant that I would tell you when you were ready. I should also say," he stopped. The selection paused. "That I would understand if what I tell you changes what you want to do with the situation you are in." She looked at him steadily. The fire was between them, low and even, and the room smelled of old paper and the fir boughs Bess had put on the mantelpiece for Christmas, and she thought about 2 chairs by a window and a question asked about a book and whether the thing she was building in this house was something she had chosen or something that had simply accreted around her while she was paying attention to other things. She thought it might be both. She thought that might be all right. "Tell me when you are ready to tell me," she said. "I will hear it when you are ready." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had not fully read and had not stopped trying to read. Then he said, "Not yet." And she said, "All right," and picked up her book. And they sat in the library in the December dark until the fire burned low and neither of them said anything further. And it was, she thought, the most honest conversation she had had in some time, not because of what was said, but because of the accuracy of what was withheld, and the mutual understanding of why. Edmund Halloway arrived at Ashmore Hall on a Wednesday afternoon in January without writing ahead, which was not characteristic of him in 30 years of serving the Thorne family's legal affairs. He had been, in Cecily's experience, a man of formal gnosis and careful arrangement, and his unannounced appearance at the door in the January cold, with mud on his boots, and the expression of a man who has been composing conversation in his head for the length of a journey, and is not certain it will hold together when spoken aloud, was the first thing that told her this was not an ordinary visit. He was 71 years old, and had been the Thorne family's solicitor since before Cecily was born, and he had the quality of very old solicitors who have served long enough to understand that the law is a vessel, and the vessel's integrity depends on what you choose to put into it and what you choose to leave out. She had always trusted him for this reason, and had also, since she was approximately 16, understood that he knew things he had chosen to leave out, which was a different kind of trust and a more complicated one. Bess showed him to the small sitting room and sent for tea, and Cecily came down and closed the door and sat across from him and waited. He arranged himself in the chair with the deliberateness of a man whose joints require more consideration than they once did, and he looked at her with the assessment of someone trying to determine how much she already knows and she looked back with the expression she wore when she was going to let someone else establish the terms of a conversation because they had information she needed and she did not want to foreclose it with her own. "I heard," he said, "that you have been working through the estate correspondence." "Yes," she said. "The French contracts, the Beaumont claim, yes." He looked at his hands, which were folded in his lap with the careful stillness of a man who has learned to keep them still. "I should have come sooner," he said. "I told myself there was no urgency, that the situation was resolved, or resolving." He paused. "I told myself that because it was more comfortable than the alternative." She waited. "The Duke's father," Holloway said. "The previous Duke. You understand that I was not his solicitor. I was your father's, yes. And that in that capacity I saw documents that pertained to both families." He looked at the window, at the January light that was flat and without direction, the light of a season that has decided to withhold itself. "The contract that damaged your father's estate was not a failed venture," he said. "It did not fail. It was designed. The terms were written to extract capital over time, in amounts small enough to appear to be ordinary losses, from someone who trusted the parties involved and did not have the French to read the original." He stopped. "Your father was told the English summary was accurate. It was not." The room was very quiet. From somewhere in the house, the clock on the main landing struck the half-hour. Cecily looked at Holloway and thought about the letter with the red ribbon. "The Thorne debt is not what they believe it to be," and felt the architecture of the past 10 years rearrange itself around a central fact that had been present all along, and that she had been approaching from the wrong angle. "The previous Duke," she said, "was the principal party to the original contract," Holloway said. "Yes." She sat with this. She did not let it move through her face, because her face was not the right instrument for this moment. What this moment required was precision, not expression. "And you knew," she said. "I knew when it was too late to prevent the damage," he said. "Her father was already ill. The estate was already—" He stopped. "I have asked myself many times what I should have done. I believe I was a coward about it. I told myself that your father was dying and the knowledge would only cause him pain, and that I would find a way to address it after, when the situation was clearer." He looked at her. "The situation did not become clearer. The previous Duke died. The new Duke—" He paused again. "I was not certain what the new Duke knew." "You are still not certain," she said. "No," he said. "I came here in part to ask you." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the library in November, about not in the correspondence boxes, and "I will tell you when you are ready," and the quality of what had been withheld between them, which was not deception, she had understood for some time, but preparation, the careful withholding of someone who knows that a thing said at the wrong moment does more damage than the same thing said in the right one. She thought about the bundle with the red ribbon, moved now to the locked drawer, and the letter that had been written by a man trying to find form for something he needed to say and had never found it. "He knows something," she said. "I do not yet know exactly what." Holloway looked at her with the expression of a man hearing a sentence that tells him more than it appears to. "Has he told you?" "Not in full," she said. "I believe he intends to." She paused. "I believe he has been trying to find the right form for it." Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the care of someone stepping onto uncertain ground, "When you married him, you understood the debt was you believed it was the result of a failed venture." "Yes," she said. "And you did not know that the venture was designed to fail." "No," she said. "I did not know that." Another silence. Longer. She watched understanding move across his face, the understanding of a man who has come to ascertain what someone knows and has discovered that what they did not know is the more significant finding. He had come, she understood now, because he was afraid she had found out on her own, without context, without the preparation that might allow her to understand the shape of it before she reacted to the fact of it. He had come because he was afraid of what she might do if she arrived at it unaccompanied. Then there is something I should give you, he said. He reached into his coat and brought out a folded document, bound with legal tape, sealed with his firm's strycel. He held it across the table to her. I have had this for 10 years. It is the original contract, the one signed by the previous Duke and your father. The one that is not what your father was told it was. He paused. I kept it because I believed that one day someone would need it. I was not certain who or for what purpose. I believe I understand now. She took the document. She did not open it. She set it in her lap and looked at Holloway and said, Frederick Stein. He looked at her. He knows, she said, or knows enough. He has been using it. Holloway's expression moved through several things rapidly and settled on something that was not surprise but was its neighbor. What makes you say so? The Beaumont claim, she said. The misdirection of the correspondence. The way he positions himself here. She paused. He does not want the story told. He wants to be the person who is owed silence about it. That is a different arrangement from wanting money. Holloway sat with this for a moment. If the original contract were presented formally, Frederick loses his position, she said, which is built on being the person who knows and has not said. If the knowledge becomes general, the position evaporates. She looked down at the document in her lap. But presenting it requires me to make the previous Duke's actions public, which means she stopped. Which means the current Duke's family, Holloway said carefully. Yes, she said. They sat in the sitting room with the January light and the tea going cold between them and the document in her lap. And Cecily thought about a man sitting in a chair beside a window, asking, May I can continue, and meaning something she had not understood at the time, and understood fully now, and she thought about what it meant to have built something in a house that had this underneath it, and whether the building was undone by the foundation, or whether the foundation could be replaced while the building stood. She did not know. She needed to know something else first. Thank you, she said to Holloway, for bringing it. He looked at her with the assessment of a man who has spent 50 years reading situations and who is reading this one carefully. What will you do? I am going to talk to my husband, she said. She waited until after dinner. She waited not from avoidance, but because she needed the hours of the afternoon to hold what she now knew alongside what she had already known and let the full shape of it settle before she brought it to anyone else. She worked in the estate office with the translation and Beelzy attestation and the Kessel correspondence. And she worked methodically and without haste, and at 4 o'clock she unlocked the locked drawer and placed Holloway's document beside the letter with the red ribbon, and she looked at them together for a moment, and then she locked the drawer again and went to dress for dinner. Dinner was quiet. He read the stillness in her. She thought he was, by now, a careful reader of her register, as she was of his, and he did not press it, but he was more present than usual. His attention directed at her rather than at the middle distance that occupied him when he was thinking about something else. After dinner they went to the library, and she did not sit down. She said, Holloway came today. He set down the book he had been about to open. He looked at her with the expression that was not the page 33 expression, and not the assessing one, but the third one, the one she had been reading the edges of for 2 months and could now read fully. And what it said was, I have been waiting for this, and I am afraid of it, and I am not going to look away from it. She told him what Holloway had said. She told it precisely, in the order it had been told to her, without editorializing. When she reached the point at which Holloway had produced the document, she paused, and Nathaniel said nothing, and she said, He has had the original contract for 10 years. A silence. The fire was between them, and the room was warm, and the January dark was outside, and the house was entirely quiet around them. I know there is an original contract, he said. His voice was level. The levelness was costing something. Known since the year after my father died, when I found his correspondence with the Beaumont concern. The full correspondence, not the summary. He looked at the fire. I understood what had been done. I did not understand the full extent of what it had done to your family until I engaged Cecil to look into the Thorne estate situation. He paused. That was 4 years ago. She looked at him. 4 years ago.
Yes.
And the Honua was the only resolution I could construct that did not require. He stopped. Started again, with the precision of a man who has found the accurate words after a long search and is not going to use different ones now. That did not require me to say publicly what my father had done, which would have the estate, the title, the families who depend on it. He stopped again. I told myself that the arrangement was fair, that you would have what security the marriage could provide, that it was better than the alternatives. He looked at her. I did not tell myself, because I did not want to face it, that you had the right to know what you were agreeing to and why. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the half-hour. The letter in the drawer, she said. Your father's letter. Something moved through his face that she had not seen there before. You found it, yes. In November. She paused. He was trying to write it down, what he had done. He could not find the form for it. No, Nathaniel said. He never could. He looked at the fire again, and she saw, for a moment, the shape of 6 years of carrying a thing that could not be set down and could not be spoken of, and she thought of the careful attention and the page 33 and the may, I continue, and all the small acts of respect that had been. She understood now. A man trying to give her something real in the absence of being able to give her the truth, because the truth was not yet his to give cleanly. Frederick, she said, has known since the same time I did, he said. He found different correspondence. He has not said so directly. He has simply been here, found things convenient. The last word had the specific weight it always had from him, which was contempt expressed through precision. I have been trying to find a way to address it that does not also require addressing the other thing. I have not found one. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the locked drawer and the 2 documents in it, and Holloway's sitting room, and the French original, and what she had and what it meant, and whether it possible to resolve one thing without the other, and she concluded, as she had suspected she would, that it was not. I believe, she said carefully, that it may be possible to address both at once. If the original contract is presented formally, Frederick's position depends on the story remaining untold. If the story is told by us in the form we choose, before he can use it, his position evaporates, and the Beaumont claim falls at the same time, because the 2 mismatched documents come from the same source. He looked at her. Telling it publicly means people will know what your father did, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Outside, the January wind had started against the windows, the particular sound of a night that has decided to be colder than the day. And you, he said, knowing what the marriage was built on, what it was intended to address. He stopped. You have the right to I am going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer it precisely. He looked at her. When you sat down in the chair by the window, she said, and asked if you could continue, was that were you? She stopped. She realized, doing the thing he did, searching for the accurate form before speaking it. Did you know when you asked that the house you had brought me to was built on what was done to my family? And did you sit down in that chair anyway, because you wanted to, because you wanted the conversation, not the arrangement? The conversation. He was very still. The expression was fully readable. Whoa! And what it said, was the thing she had been reading the edges of for 2 months and had been afraid to read directly because of what it would require of her when she did. Yes, he said, to both. She sat with this. She sat with it for long enough that the fire shifted and the wind moved against the windows, and Nathaniel did not look away, and she did not look away. And she thought about what it meant to have walked into a house carrying a wrong foundation and spent 3 months building something on top of it that was, in itself, not wrong, and whether the building could stand if the foundation were replaced rather than demolished. She thought it could. She thought it would require work. She thought she was, by disposition and by practice, a person who did not walk away from work. "I am going to need the document," she said. "Halloway's document and the Beaumont translation and Beale's attestation." She paused. "I am going to need to present them at the Derby sitting. With you present." She paused again. "And I am going to need you to let me do it." He looked at her. "Let you." "Choose to let me," she said. "There is a difference." He was quiet for a moment, with the expression fully present. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Your signature on an authorization transferring custody of the original contract to me," she said. "Not to the estate. To me. So that when Frederick argues that the presentation is interested, I can demonstrate that I hold the document independently." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. The fire was low between them, and the room had the quality of a room in which something has been decided even before the decision has been stated. "I will have it drawn up tonight," he said. "Thank you," she said. She went to the door, and then she stopped, with her hand not quite on the door frame, because there was one more thing, and it was the thing she had been carrying since the sitting room, with Halloway and the cold tea and the document in her lap. "The situation you described," she said, without turning around. "You told yourself the arrangement was fair, and did not tell yourself that I had the right to know." She paused. "I understand why. I do not mean that I think it was right. I mean that I understand the shape of it, what you were carrying, and how long, and why you could not put it down cleanly." She turned then. "When this is resolved, I would like us to try the other thing." He looked at her. "The conversation," she said, "not the arrangement." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that she could read willfully now, and that said, underneath everything else it said, that he had been trying, since October, to find the form for exactly this sentence, and had not found it, and that she had just said it for him. "Yes," he said, "I would like that." She went out. He remained in the library. From the estate office, later, she heard him moving the particular sound of the desk drawer, the scrape of a chair, the scratch of a pen that meant he was doing what he had said he would do. She sat at her own desk, with the locked drawer open in front of her, and the two documents in it, and thought about the morning she had signed her name beside his in the register of a parish church, and looked at the two signatures together, and felt the completion of a calculation, and she thought, the calculation was not wrong, only the variables were different from what she had thought, and the result is different from what she had expected, and she was not certain yet what the result was, but she was beginning to believe it was something she would choose. She closed the locked drawer. She went to bed. She slept, for the first time in a week, without the specific restlessness of a person who has a question they have not yet been able to ask. The magistrate's court in Derby sat on the third Tuesday of each month in a room above the market hall that smelled of old wood and official business and the particular gravity of a place where things were decided and written down and could not easily be undone. Cecily had been to Derby twice, since October, once to buy the leather notebook and once with Nathaniel to meet with Cecil about the Beaumont claim, and she knew the road well enough by now that she did not need to watch for landmarks. She watched the Derbyshire fields instead, which in January were all structure and no surface, and she thought about what she was about to do and whether she was doing it correctly. She had the documents. She had Beale's attestation, countersigned by the French legal specialist and filed with Kessel's office. She had her translation, fair copied and bound, with the relevant passages marked in the margins. She had Halloway's document, the original contract, bearing two signatures, one of them her father's, and one of them the seal of the previous Duke of Ashmore, in the leather case on the seat beside her. She had the authorization, transferring its custody to her, signed by Nathaniel the previous night, witnessed by Bess and Kessel, and filed before 8 in the morning. What she did not have, which she had expected to have, was Halloway. He had sent a message at 7 that morning, a note in his careful, reduced handwriting, explaining that he had been visited the previous evening by a representative of Frederick Stein who had raised, with considerable specificity, certain questions about the provenance of the documents in Halloway's possession and the professional consequences of presenting materials that might be characterized as improperly obtained or selectively preserved. The message said that Halloway was not withdrawing his support, but that he required more time to consult with counsel before he could appear in a formal proceeding. She read the message in the carriage and put it in the leather case and thought about what more time meant when the sitting was in 4 hours. And Frederick had clearly known about it and had moved the evening before, which meant he had known about the authorization and had understood what it signified, and had calculated that removing Halloway as a witness would be sufficient to delay proceedings past the point where the Beaumont claim could be contested in this sitting. She thought about what she had without Halloway. She had the documents. She had Beale's attestation. She had Kessel, who was meeting her at the court. She had the authorization. She did not have an independent witness to the original contract's authenticity, someone who had been present at its creation, or who had seen both parties sign and could speak to its provenance in a formal proceeding. The carriage arrived in Derby. She went into the court building and found Kessel in the anteroom, who looked at her face and said, "Halloway." "Yes," she said. Kessel thought for a moment with the practiced efficiency of a solicitor who has encountered obstacles to proceedings before and has learned to assess them quickly. Without an independent witness to the original contract, he said, "Stein's counsel will argue that the document's provenance is unestablished and that it cannot be admitted as primary evidence in this sitting. They will request a continuance. How long? 60 days at minimum. The Beaumont claim would proceed in the interval." She looked at the room, at the other people waiting, at the clerk behind the desk, at the door to the inner chamber where the magistrates were already in session on earlier matters. She looked at the leather case and thought about 60 days and the Beaumont concern and Frederick in the entrance hall of Ashmore, saying a man finds it convenient with the specific quality of a man who intends to continue finding it convenient. And she thought about what she had that she had not yet accounted for. She said, "Who is in the building?" Kessel looked at her. "As witnesses," she said. "Who is here today for other matters?" Kessel consulted the morning's docket. He said there was a property dispute in the next room involving 2 families from the northern county, a licensing matter, and a matter concerning a disputed will in which the witness was Dunnett, she said, reading the name over his shoulder. Kessel looked at her. "He knew my father," she said. "He has been on Ashmore land since before the previous Duke inherited. If he was present during the period of the original contract, if he has knowledge of the arrangement," she stopped. "I need to speak to him before the sitting begins." She was out the door before Kessel finished his sentence. She found Dunnett in the corridor outside the will dispute room, sitting on a bench with his hat in his hands in the manner of a man who has been waiting for some time and is prepared to wait longer. He looked up when she approached, and his expression moved through several things: recognition, rapidly, recognition, wariness, the particular assessment of a man who has been watching a situation for a long time and is deciding whether this is the moment it resolves. She sat down beside him on the bench. She did not preamble. She said, "In 1806, when the contract between my father and the previous Duke was signed, were you aware of what was in it?" He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was busy enough that their conversation was private without being concealed, which she had chosen deliberately. He said, "I knew the old Duke went to your father with a proposition. I knew your father trusted him. I knew what happened after." "The English summary your father was given," she said. "Was it accurate?" "No," he said, simply, without hesitation. "You knew that at the time." He turned his hat in his hands. "I was a tenant," he said. "I had no standing to." He stopped. "Yes, I knew." She looked at him. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time, and who has possibly been waiting for someone to ask him about it directly rather than around it. "I need you to say that today," she said, in the sitting. "Not the detail of the contract, you would not have seen the full document, but that you were aware of the arrangement, that you understood the English summary was not accurate, and that the transaction you witnessed was not what my father believed it to be." He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She did not press. She had learned, from months of working with documents that required patience, that some things could not be hurried without breaking. "Your father was a good man," he said at last. "Yes," she said, "he was." He looked at his hat for another moment. Then he looked up. "All right," he said. The sitting began at 11. Frederick was there, seated with his solicitor at the respondent's table, a London man named Prine, who had the polished confidence of someone who had arrived prepared for a specific proceeding and was recalibrating now that the room contained people he had not expected. Frederick's expression, when he saw Dunnet, underwent a careful adjustment that he was not quite fast enough to complete before she saw it. Cecily presented the documents in the order she had determined during the carriage ride. The Beaumont claim first, then her translation, then Beale's attestation, then the original French contract, then the original Thorne-Ashmore contract. She spoke in the even, precise register she used for things that mattered, without inflection and without emphasis, because the documents did not require emphasis, they required only to be read. She read them, or the relevant passages of them, aloud and in full. Prine objected to the original contract. He argued that its provenance was unestablished, that its custodian Halloway was not present to attest to it, and that without independent verification, the document could not be admitted as primary evidence. Dunnet was called. He gave his name and his tenure on Ashmore land and the year of his first memory of the Thorne-Ashmore arrangement, and he said in the plain, unhurried voice of a man who has decided to be accurate that he had been present in the yard of the Thorne house in the autumn of 1806, when the previous Duke had come to conclude an arrangement with Cecily's father, and that he had subsequently observed the subsequent arrangement on the Thorne estate over the following 3 years, and that what he had observed was not consistent with a failed commercial venture, but with a systematic extraction of capital. Prine attempted to challenge this on the grounds of expertise. A tenant farmer could not be expected to assess the operation of a commercial contract. The presiding magistrate said that a tenant farmer who had worked the land adjacent to the Thorne estate for 40 years could be expected to know the difference between a farm that had lost money through misfortune and a farm from which money had been removed, and that the objection was overruled. Frederick spoke then, which Prine had advised him not to do, and which he did anyway because Frederick was a man who, when his prepared position began to fail, reached instinctively for the authority of his own voice. He said that the documents presented had been assembled by a party with a clear personal interest in their interpretation, that the custody arrangement was irregular, and that the court should consider what motivated a newly married woman to spend her first months at Ashmore Hall mining her husband's family's history for weapons to use against his relations. She let him finish. The room was quiet. She looked at the presiding magistrate and said, with the precision she kept for sentences that needed to carry their own weight, "The document was custodied by Mr. Halloway for 10 years before my marriage. The authorization transferring custody to me was signed by my husband and filed this morning. The Beaumont claim predates my involvement with any of these documents by 12 years. I have presented what I found because it is accurate, and I have presented it now because a claim is being made against my husband's estate based on the same source of misdirection that damaged my father's estate 10 years ago. I have no other motivation than accuracy, which I submit is sufficient." The magistrate looked at her. He looked at Frederick. He looked at Prine, who had the expression of a man watching a position collapse in real time and calculating the minimum damage of an orderly retreat. The sitting took 37 minutes in total. The Beaumont claim was denied. The original contract was admitted to the record. The magistrate noted for the record that the misdirection of the correspondence constituted a matter that the court considered sufficiently documented to warrant further examination, at which point Prine said very quietly, something to Frederick that Cecily did not hear, and Frederick sat down. Outside, on the Derby Market Street, in the January cold that had the particular clarity of a day that has just decided to be bright after a long period of gray, she stood with Kessel on one side and Dunnet on the other and breathed. Dunnet put on his hat. He looked at her and said, "Your father would have been glad of it, I think so," she said. He walked back to the court building for his own matter. Kessel said several things about the legal implications that she heard and retained and would process later when she was not standing on a street in Derby, feeling the specific unfamiliar sensation of having done something she had not known she was capable of until she did it. She went home. Nathaniel was in the estate office when she arrived. He came into the entrance hall when he heard the carriage, and he looked at her face, and she said, "It is done." And he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Come in and sit down," which was what he said when something needed to be received rather than processed. And she came in and sat down and told him all of it. And he listened with the full attention he gave things that mattered to him. And when she finished, he said, "Done it," with a quality that was not surprise, but was something that had to find its expression carefully. He was waiting to be asked, she said. Nathaniel looked at the fire. "I should have asked him years ago." "You did not know he knew," she said. "I only knew because he told me with his face in December, and I was paying attention." He looked at her then with the expression she could read fully now and said, "You are always paying attention." "Yes," she said, "it is a habit." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood and went to the desk and opened the top drawer and brought back the philosophical essays, her copy, which had been traveling between them for 3 months, and he set it on the table between them with a piece of paper folded inside it. At the page she had first been reading when he came into the room in October and asked if he could continue. She looked at the book. She looked at him. "Page 97, he said, "where you said he was wrong about the third premise." She took the book and opened it to the folded paper. It was a single sheet in his handwriting, the compressed, precise hand she had read on estate documents and authorizations, and the draft of the Kessel letter and the margin notes he sometimes left in books, and it said, "You were right about the third premise." He conflates the circumstances with the act. I have been making the same mistake. The circumstance of how this began is not the same as what it has become. I do not know how to say the second part of that, in a way that does not sound like a continuation of the first, so I am writing it instead, which is what I do when the spoken form is inadequate. The spoken form is inadequate. What I mean is, I would like to continue, not the arrangement. The other thing, if you are willing, she read it once, she read it again. She looked up at him, and he was looking at her with the expression that was. She now understood, the one he had been wearing every time she had looked at him directly, and had looked away before she was ready to read it. She put the paper down on the table. She put her hand on top of it. She said, "You wrote it on the page where you first read the argument." "Yes," he said. "Because that is when you started trying to find the form for it." "Yes," he said. "How long ago was that?" she said. He looked at the book. "October," he said. "The first week." She sat with this, the image of writing that sentence in October, in the first week, and carrying it in the book through November and December and January, waiting for the right moment. And the right moment had turned out to be after everything else was resolved, which was, she thought, exactly like him to want to give her a thing cleanly, without the arrangement underneath it, to wait until the arrangement was no longer the operative context. She said, "May I continue?" He looked at her. That is what you asked, she said. In October, it seems appropriate to ask it back. He looked at her for a moment with the full expression, and then he said, with the precision of a man who has found the form at last, "Yes, please." She picked up the book. She opened it to page 97. She held it out to him and he took it, and she let it go, and neither of them looked away this time. In the morning, Peg came into the room to lay the fire and found the French philosophical essays on the writing table beside the window, not on the desk, not on the bedside shelf where it usually lived, but on the writing table, in the particular position of a thing that has been set down in the middle of being read and will be picked up again when the reader returns. There were 2 bookmarks in it, a narrow strip of folded paper at page 97, which was where she had always seen it, and a tradesman's pencil at page 31, which was a different place entirely. Peg looked at the book. She looked at the 2 bookmarks. She had the expression of a woman who has been watching a situation develop for 3 months and has just received the confirmation she had been expecting and is satisfied to have been right. She laid the fire. She went downstairs and told the kitchen that breakfast should be held until 9:30, which was half an hour later than usual, and that the small pot of chocolate should be brought up as well as the tea, because the Duchess had mentioned once in November that she liked it, and no one had thought to provide it since. She carried the tray up herself. This is not a story about a forced marriage. It is a story about a question asked at the wrong time by someone who did not yet know all of what he was asking, and about the woman who understood the question before he did, who read the 3rd premise and the margin note and the provenance of everything, and who chose, with full information and clear eyes, to answer yes. Some things cannot be said until the circumstances change. What remains true is what the act is, not what surrounds it. He had been right to wait for the right form. She had been right to wait until she knew what she was choosing. The waiting had not been wasted. It had been, in the end, the most honest thing either of them did. Cecily Thorne signed a marriage contract without knowing its full history. She arrived at Ashmore Hall with 2 trunks, a book of French philosophy, and the habit of reading things more carefully than anyone expected. She left nothing unread. What she found was not what she had been told she would find, not a cold arrangement, not a simple transaction, not a man who wanted a capable wife for practical reasons. What she found was someone who had also been waiting in his own way for the right form, and who had written it down in October and carried it through once because he wanted to give it to her cleanly. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like. It is the clearest signal that this kind of work is worth making. Share it with someone who believes that the most romantic thing a person can do is wait until they can offer something real and then offer it without conditions. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next story reaches you. Here is the question we cannot agree on. When Nathaniel wrote that note in October, the first week, before he knew what she would do, before any of it was resolved, and then carried it for 4 months waiting for the right moment, was that patience? Or was it another form of the same caution that caused all the trouble in the first place? And when Cecily asked, "May I continue?" back to him, was she forgiving him, or was she telling him the answer had already been decided? Tell us in the comments. The next story arrives soon.